My guest on this week's podcast is returning to Topple Uncaged. He is a groundbreaking journalist, one of the best, I think, of our generation, and he has recently come back from spending about 3 weeks on the ground in Venezuela. So we are going to be discussing that, the latest developments in the ongoing coup over there, but we are also going to be touched on another hot issue at the moment, which is, of course, the anti-Semitism crisis, not only in the Labour Party, but the unfolding situation in the Democrats in the US. I'm extremely honoured to have him back on again. It's such a privilege. I'm thrilled to welcome Max Blumenthal. Max, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast. It's a real pleasure.
Thanks for having me back.
No. It's lovely. It's great to have you back again. It's brilliant insights last time when we discussed about Venezuela, which, of course, no one would expect any less from you. Let's kick off with Venezuela. I want to deal with the here and now first. So we're recording on Friday, the 8th of March. The latest sort of big story to come out of the situation there is this catastrophic power cut, which is affecting most of the country. There's talk of possible fatalities as we were going to record, because obviously the situation in hospitals, there was concerns over children who were on life support. Maduro's administration is blaming the far right, and some people are saying there could well be external forces at play, namely possibly the US government or some of its agents. I mean, what's your take on that? Is Maduro's administration right in what they're saying? Is it down to the far right?
You know, I'll wait to see if there's evidence. There have been a lot of blackouts in Venezuela over the years. In 2018, there was a blackout where 21 out of 27 states were left without electricity for a period. However, there have been a series of opposition-directed sabotage attacks on Venezuelan infrastructure last week. Warehouse where thousands of boxes of food, which are distributed at virtually free of cost to Venezuela's poor and working class, was torched, apparently by opposition elements. A week prior, oil infrastructure, which is used to export oil, was attacked and basically blown up with explosives. And we remember last year that Nicolas Maduro came under attack himself during a military parade by drone. And a lot of the U.S. press and the kind of neoconservative elements in Washington said, "Oh, it's a false flag, it's a joke." They became truthers, and Maduro produced pretty much very conclusive evidence, or his government produced conclusive evidence of the attack and who was behind it. And these elements were in Colombia, and the Colombian government did absolutely nothing to cooperate with the investigation or to allow the extradition of these elements, which can be concisely described as terrorists. There was a massive blackout also right before the coup that deposed and killed Salvador Allende, the elected president of Chile. This is not something that's completely out of the question. And I could also tell you or report to you that yesterday I watched the Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing chaired by Marco Rubio on Venezuela, where Rubio openly called for widespread unrest as a strategy to encourage regime change in Venezuela. So he openly called for widespread unrest. Then he took to Twitter to celebrate the electricity outage. And then you have the situation in the streets in Caracas, which I've been monitoring. The situation's calm. People are without electricity. The government is working to restore it, and in some parts of Caracas, it has started to come back. Telesur, which is the Latin American broadcaster based in Caracas and Quito, Ecuador, which is funded by the progressive governments, largely by Venezuela, carried out its first Spanish broadcast from Quito today because its studios in Caracas were without power. So people are kind of doing what they can, but the widespread unrest that Rubio openly seeks to encourage isn't taking place right now as a result of this blackout. And, when Rubio does take to Twitter to make jokes about the lights being out, along with members of Venezuela's opposition, especially these kind of exiled figures, average Venezuelans look at that and they see somebody who is mocking their plight, who's mocking the fact that, they can't iron their clothes, they can't do basic things, that maybe hospitals have to run off of generators in order to treat people. And that affects everyone regardless of how they feel about the Venezuelan government. And it just deepens the distrust and resentment that average Venezuelans have of the U.S. government and of the biggest loudmouths in it, like Marco Rubio.
Absolutely. You've touched on something very interesting there, actually, Max. I mean, I've been watching what Rubio's been saying, and his Twitter output is quite staggering. I mean, this kind of incitement, if you like, from US officials over foreign powers, as it were, is nothing unusual. I mean, we've been here so many times before, but it doesn't, as you say, it doesn't appear to be having any effect as such with ordinary people on the ground. I mean, do you think we're going to see a ramping up of this rhetoric from the US to try and stoke the fires? Because it doesn't seem to be working at the minute, does it?
Well, I actually think, someone like Elliot Abrams, who probably belongs in some kind of prison for what he's done in Central America, is actually trying to temper his rhetoric because he's just simply not as stupid as Marco Rubio. I mean, Marco Rubio is just a genuinely dumb, hot-headed frat boy. And if you actually look at his background, I mean, this isn't someone with great intellectual acumen who spent his younger years working really hard to take advantage of the American dream. This is someone who spent his time at foam parties in college and in D.C. when he was kind of a Republican apparatchik. So Abrams understands that. Abrams and Rubio, they share the same goal: regime change, destabilization, and they want to pick on what they call military elites. They want the military to flip because they know if the military doesn't flip, nothing happens. And so Abrams understands that, threats of military action against Venezuela could be useful. He admitted in a call he had with Russian prank callers who were impersonating the president of the Swiss Federation, which shows that Abrams isn't that smart because he fell for this call where these guys have very, very thick Russian accent and they're saying, I am the president of Switzerland and I know where Maduro bank accounts are. And then he's like, yes, I'll send you a list of all the officials we'll get all the assets. And he totally fell for it. But he said that he actually made an interesting admission, which is that the threats of military action are just designed to make the military nervous and to encourage defection. Make them say, I don't want to go up against the U.S. military. I'll defect so my family doesn't lose their breadwinner, yada, yada, yada. But Marco Rubio is saying the military elites should defect, and he's saying they'll be killed, just like all of, Gaddafi wasn't just killed with a bayonet. He wasn't just sodomized by a bayonet by U.S.-backed jihadists. All of his bodyguards were beheaded. They were killed in that attack. His entire entourage was savagely massacred. And so that's a message that Rubio's sending to the Venezuelan military, especially the high command, that the U.S. is going to kill you. So it's stupid. Beyond the fact that the whole thing is cynical and absolutely evil because the U.S. has implemented a coup against the sovereign government, the way they're going about it and the outsourcing of it to Rubio, who's sort of the figurehead of the Miami Cuban Venezuelan exile lobby, is just plain stupid.
Absolutely, and it's a fascinating metaphor, really, I suppose. And correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it's a fascinating metaphor for Trump's tenure more broadly, isn't it? Because you have Rubio and those sort of characters, which, as you so eloquently described, essentially frat boys who spent their time at phone parties and the youths, and then you have the Abrahams figures who are the more, for want of a better phrase, educated in terms of the system, who are more reserved and I suppose playing the longer game, as it were. And that kind of sums up the situation with the US administration more broadly, does it not?
It does, and it's funny to see Trump outsource one of his key foreign policy agendas to a guy that he denigrated as Little Marco in the debates. And Little Marco is actually, along with all of the neocons that Trump denigrated, reversed the key promise that Trump made to his base, a base of voters that bore the moral injury of the war in Iraq, which is to not get embroiled in foreign quagmires and to have a non-interventionist foreign policy. And the Trump administration has basically turned into like a jobs program for neocons. Then you have just the whole post-Cold War U.S. foreign policy and the way that the bipartisan national security state has developed and functioned along the lines of this R2P, responsibility to protect, humanitarian interventionist agenda, and how it always produces humanitarian catastrophe, de-democratizes societies, whittles away at whatever social protections there were for the most vulnerable in societies, from Yugoslavia all the way through Iraq, which was supposed to be a cakewalk, to Libya, where we were told that there was going to be this vibrant democracy once Gaddafi was removed, to Syria, where the U.S. thankfully failed, but through a proxy war, along with its Gulf allies, managed to produce one of the worst refugee crises since World War II, and the deaths of some 250,000 people, with over 100,000 of those deaths being on the government side, something no one ever says in UK or US media. And now you have another situation where they thought they were going into a cakewalk. An Argentinian newspaper reported yesterday that Mike Pence, who, his international experience was limited as governor of Indiana to having breakfast at the International House of Pancakes, is furious at Juan Guaido, the sort of puppet leader, because Guaido promised him that the military would defect. And now you've had about, 300 to 500 defections out of something like 30,000 figures. 300,000. And so Pence is like, wait a minute, we were tricked. This wasn't a cakewalk. But that's the way every intervention the U.S. has staged since the Cold War, Yugoslavia being the only one that's regarded as a success in Washington, has gone. They think it's going to be easy. They think it's going to lead to democracy, and they get exactly the opposite. In this case, they've been completely stymied.
No, absolutely. And this kind of, as Naomi Klein called it, this shock doctrine kind of tactic, if you were. It beggars belief that they keep doing it. And I think we touched on this before, that they keep doing it. It's the same narrative, the same textbook script, and yet it never has, as you quite rightly point out, the desired effect. The strategy, from what I read, the US strategy moving forward with Venezuela is going to be a case of ramping up sanctions, if we believe what we read in the likes of the New York Times. That's their modus operandi with this. Do you think that is correct? Do you think that is going to be their way forward? And if you do think that's correct, do you think it will succeed?
Well, watching the Senate hearing yesterday, where Rubio was really running the show, he invited all kinds, these Venezuelan exiles to sit in the gallery. What you saw was a display of desperation. Plan B, first of all, there was Plan A, enacted on January 22nd, where Guaido declares himself the president, this guy no one had ever heard of, and rides around on a motorcycle. Looks like everything's going to work out, except the real government stays in place, and their rallies actually outnumber those of a very fractured opposition, with Guaido representing a party, Popular Will, whose approval rating is 6%. Not a very popular party because they've been so involved in violence and destabilization over the years. Plan B was February 23rd, the attempt to ram through the U.S. humanitarian aid. I was in Venezuela for that, and I actually watched the coup collapse on that day. I had a chance to go to the border, to the Venezuelan side, and see what was going to happen, but I thought it would be more interesting to monitor the situation inside Caracas. And so I went to the main opposition rally, which focused on a military base, an air base, and they surrounded the base. One of the big opposition leaders, Maria Corina Machado, gives this speech in front of the base like she's Evita. She calls for Venezuela to be liberated from the dictator. She leaves the rally. The crowd follows her out. And I swear to God, within 10 minutes, I had just left and gone to lunch. And I followed them into the neighborhood of Altamira, where there are some nice restaurants. And everybody's having lunch at the Chinese places. And that's the end. It just completely ended there with lunch. And people just kind of gave up. The melee that they tried to start on the border didn't lead to any escalation. The Venezuelan government played it right. And the Colombian government did not want to have a military escalation. We subsequently learned that Guaido had assembled an army of 200 Venezuelan exiles to actually attack the Venezuelan police, and the Colombian military scuttled that plan and said, this is insane, we're not going to allow that to take place. So Guaido actually did want to take it to the next level. Then Guaido came back. You know, he's acting like a piece of bait on the tip of Trump's pole. And again, the Venezuelan government played it very deftly and did not arrest him, did not fall for that provocation, because they recognized how he's being weakened and the opposition is starting to fracture. And so now we're at Plan C, which is just more sanctions. Sanction Maduro's dog catcher, sanction his dog and sanction the dog catcher. They have rescinded visas for 77 Venezuelan officials. Don't know who they are. I hope they're not UN officials, because that would be something that would seem to violate the spirit of the UN Charter. But, you know, the sanctions are deepening. And so back to the hearing yesterday, it was really interesting to watch because they brought two experts out, or quote-unquote experts. One is a guy named Eric Farnsworth from a group called the Council on the Americas, which is David Rockefeller's corporate roundtable for Latin America. David Rockefeller being the late oligarchic scion of the Rockefeller family. And they represent, you know, the oil industry, the weapons industry, and the financial industry in Latin America, which means they control the right-wing countries of the Lima Group. And if you donate $50,000 to the Council on the Americas, you'll get a special meeting. You get what they call in their materials executive access. And so you get to meet with leaders of the Lima Group and lobby them for investment opportunities. So this is one guy. Obviously, he's dying for regime change. He's saying every talking point Marco Rubio wants to hear. Then the other expert is a woman whose name I forget because she's sort of unremarkable, but she's from the Woodrow Wilson Center, which is a U.S.-funded think tank in Washington, and she seems to be more of a liberal Democrat who wants regime change too. She wants the neoliberal kind of Washington consensus back in Venezuela, but she's very worried about sanctions. She actually started arguing with Rubio that sanctions would starve the Venezuelan people and that starving people don't get out into the streets. And so she said, well, we both want widespread unrest. Starving people don't actually have the ability to go out and protest. So we shouldn't starve them. And then Rubio is like, no, we're going to do it all. We're going to do it all. So that's where I think it's going. It is moving towards a situation of starvation or attempted starvation. But the other element here is that the Venezuelan government is trying to find other sources of oil sales to receive its assets. And the longer that this government remains in power, the more likely it is, and the U.S. officials freely acknowledge it, the more likely it is that they will be able to start to recover some of their ability to export as they move away from the U.S. Just one point that people should know about Venezuelan oil is that it's very heavy crude oil, and that traditionally, you know, even under Hugo Chavez and Maduro, they've relied on U.S. refineries which mix their oil with light crude and then make it possible to process. And so that requires them to kind of reorient their entire oil infrastructure, and Russia is currently helping them do that. So it's a long process. They import like 90% of their food and medicine, which is a really bad thing to do if you're being sanctioned. And so they need to find other sources of medical supplies and food. And, you know, one place would be China. So I think it's going to take a while, and there will be economic pain as the sanctions increase.
There's fascinating analysis there, and the most telling bit, which sort of stuck out for me, was what you said about the female Democrat who was arguing that no, we can't starve people; they won't be able to get out on the ground. I mean, that's just such a
right.
It's just I can't. I always come back to the same opinion that in some respects for me, the sort of hawkish Democrats are always worse than the Republicans because they're more kind of devious. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're more manipulative and they're devious. They're all little models of Hillary Clinton, and it's just a
more
staggering.
effective.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. I mean, they're just staggering thing to say. Just to wrap this section up, because this last point will lead us quite nicely into our next topic, as it were. Chomsky came out this week and called the media coverage and the media propaganda war, that's my phrase, not his, but he called it atrocious. I mean, how atrocious is atrocious? Because let's face it, the Western hawkish capitalist establishment media has been atrocious on Venezuela, but in comparison to, say, the Iraq war, in comparison to Syria, how bad is bad? Are we seeing peak manufacturing of consent here, do you think, Max?
I think it's not just manufacturing consent, which is the Chomsky-Herman model, but we're looking at inventing reality, which is Michael Parenti's understanding of corporate media. And, in many ways, we're seeing an invented reality that was almost 180 degrees the opposite from what I saw when I was in Venezuela, where, first of all, we very rarely hear about the humanitarian catastrophe that the United States, the UK, and Saudi Arabia have created in Yemen. But Venezuela is portrayed as a Yemen-like situation when it's not. And, without denying that there's an economic crisis there, it's debatable whether there is a humanitarian catastrophe that requires foreign intervention. I mean, that's not even debatable. It's just not the case. And obviously, sanctions are going to make it worse. But what I've noticed with the coverage of Venezuela, especially from CNN's Spanish network, CNN's Spanish channel, is just a straight-up information war where they're actually acting as an arm of the Venezuelan opposition without shame, to the point where they sent a masked reporter to embed with the Venezuelan and Colombian rioters, basically masked armed criminal elements who had attempted to escort the aid trucks across the Venezuelan border and were attacking Venezuelan police with Molotovs. And this reporter was acting essentially as a press secretary for these criminal elements, who wound up burning their own aid truck and then blaming it on the Venezuelan government. So, I mean, we're not looking at news. We're looking at an information war waged by mercenaries of corporate America. Who owns CNN? AT&T. AT&T has a huge stake and a huge interest in the Venezuelan economy, and they actually took on DirecTV after it pulled out. They took on its assets. They're totally tied in with the Venezuelan opposition. And these companies, as I mentioned before, there's this corporate roundtable called the Council on the Americas, which are pushing regime change in Venezuela while they're simultaneously working with the far-right Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil. Look at the corporate membership of this group. These are the owners of U.S. media. They're the owners of British private media, and they also have a stake in Venezuelan private media. Venezuela has its own private corporate media, which acts as an arm of the opposition. So we're not talking about news anymore. We're talking about information war. And it's funny how in the U.S., only networks like RT, which kind of present the other side of an information war, are discussed as a sort of insidious threat to the people.
It is, but it is always the way. And like I said, that kind of moves us on to our next subject, really, because it's very much the same thing, in my opinion, and especially over here in the UK, and quite a lot of people's opinions, actually. And this is the ongoing... I'll use the corporate media terminology for it. The ongoing anti-Semitism crisis within the Labour Party in the UK, and the sort of developing crisis with anti-Semitism within the progressive elements of the Democratic Party in the US. Now, for US listeners, the situation in the UK is that the Labour Party under leader Jeremy Corbyn has been engulfed, the corporate media would say, by an anti-Semitism crisis of epic proportions, where member after member after member of his party is being accused of anti-Semitic actions and words and posts on social media. it's all over the press. It's been all over the press for basically 2 years now, but it's peaks and troughs with it, as it were. In the US, of course, for UK listeners, we have a similar situation developing. Ilhan Omar made some extremely telling comments about the influence of Israeli money via organisations like AIPAC on US policy. Outrageous comments that she dared speak the truth, and she's been widely castigated, and the accusations of anti-Semitism are now following her. I'm going to cut straight to the chase here, Max, because, again, outside of the corporate press in the UK, it's what a lot of commentators are saying, and I know it's what people are saying in the US. Is this anti-Semitism being weaponised for political purposes, yes or no?
Well, I think people know how I'm going to respond to that question. But I guess just starting with Corbyn, I have an interesting story to relate. I don't know if you know it, but I've been, sort of used to attack Jeremy Corbyn in the British tabloids and the Daily Mail. I was on my way to London from the Russell Tribunal, which was a sort of people's tribunal where we were discussing whether Israel had committed war crimes in the Gaza Strip in 2014, a war that I covered. I was in the Gaza Strip, so I presented testimony. And I was invited to speak about that in the parliament by a parliamentarian, a backbencher from Labour I'd never heard of before, named Jeremy Corbyn. And basically, if you wanted to bring a Palestine speaker, someone who, was a credible speaker on Palestine, who was advancing the idea of equality and, a decent life for Palestinians, which they have not enjoyed, Jeremy Corbyn was the guy who would give you permission. And he unfortunately wasn't able to be there, but his staff gave me a really nice tour of Westminster. We had a great event at Portcullis. I was late to the event, and so basically anyone who showed up to the event got to come up on stage for 5 minutes, and it was kind of like a people's forum. And this pro-Israel Likudnik fanatic named Richard Millett, who's been a big figure in manufacturing the anti-Semitism freakout in the UK, was in the back. And he found that among this crowd of people, this very diverse crowd of people, of Muslims and lots of Jewish people as well, like my friend Earl Oken, who you might have heard of, who's a cabaret performer, who's also a proud Jewish anti-Zionist. All kinds of people spoke. And there was some figure I'd never heard of named James Thing or James Thring or something. And they said, Richard Millett said he's a Holocaust denier. So the next thing you know, when Corbyn is, nominated as the Labour leader, the Daily Mail turns up this piece. Jeremy Corbyn was introduced at an event by a Holocaust denier that also featured anti-Semite Max Blumenthal. And the piece was written by a Gentile who'd never had a bar mitzvah or a bris. So I don't think they can really compete with my Judaism there. But that's the way it is in the UK. I actually looked at this James Thring character. He seems like really eccentric, holds some pretty outlandish views, but I really wasn't able to determine that he was a Holocaust denier. Maybe he is, but I didn't know who he was until I saw this whole episode, and nobody else did. They basically manufactured that story, and then they just freely characterized me as an anti-Semite. And I think that's the whole way this fake scandal has developed, to the point where you now have Chris Williamson getting suspended, someone who's a veteran anti-racist. Obviously, the target isn't just Jeremy Corbyn; it's the whole Palestine solidarity movement. And I can relate another story, because I spent a lot of time in the UK speaking about Palestine in my own work. And when I was in England, until I was able to escape across into Scotland, I was hounded by this group of fanatical Zionists who at one point actually physically, I don't want to say assault, but I was definitely physically coerced to try to not enter an event that I was doing at a Quaker meeting hall in Manchester by someone who tried to physically push me and not physically allow me into the event. And I had to demand that the police come. And this was something that led me to believe that Corbyn would eventually be assaulted. Now, there was someone, all the London events, who would constantly be outside and harass me and attack me on Twitter, named Mandy Blumenthal. and she eventually confronted me in order to ask what my Jewish ancestry was, because she was participating in a campaign, I believe, to claim that I wasn't actually halakhically Jewish. In other words, I wasn't Jewish because she was claiming my mother, who is Jewish, was actually Catholic, and and so on. And we determined that we weren't related. Fortunately, I was very happy to know that this woman wasn't in my family. But then I saw her at a forum where she was being interviewed about Jeremy Corbyn at some kind of town hall event, and she was claiming that she was a former, longtime Labour supporter who could no longer support Labour now because of Corbyn. And this was just a gigantic lie by someone who had always opposed Labour, had always hated Corbyn, and it was deployed in the heart of British mainstream media. I remembered this woman from my tour, and I'm like, this is just a giant lie. So it's just like you examine all of these small incidents, and they make a mountain out of these incidents and these false allegations, and then they repeat it constantly until some section of the British public starts believing in it. I think most of the British public actually resists it. But here's kind of how I feel about it and the danger of it. The danger of it is that, first of all, what the British press and the Blairite wing of the Labour Party are doing, and all of these defectors, it's like you're not allowed to say it, but they're all Labour Friends of Israel allies, all of the Blairite defectors. What they're doing is they're conflating Israel with Judaism, because there's no doubt that Jeremy Corbyn is a critic of Israel because of its human rights record and the fact that it's implemented a project of apartheid since 1948. Jeremy Corbyn's against apartheid. But they're conflating Israel with Jews, and in doing so, they accept the same conflation that anti-Semites who seek to implicate all Jews for Israel's crimes do. And in that way, they're reinforcing an anti-Semitic perspective of Judaism, where Jews are necessarily supporters of Israel and make it easier for Jews to be implicated for Israel's crimes. Another thing they've done is cheapen the accusation of anti-Semitism to the point where it has no meaning, which allows real anti-Semites who exist in UK society, in all across the West, it allows them to brand themselves as free speech martyrs when they are accused of anti-Semitism correctly, and to say, no, this is just another fabrication just like the kind against Jeremy Corbyn and others. And so they are emboldening real anti-Semites. And finally, what they are doing is seeking to erase the painful cavalry that Palestinians have experienced since even before 1948. They've erased the Palestinians as a people and driven them not just further into occupation and apartheid. What they've done is they've driven them out of the debate and the narrative that everybody in the West needs to hear. Their voices have just been completely left out of this debate, and that's the point of it. That's the ultimate point of it.
Absolutely, and I think your narrative on how, essentially, as you say, people who, the Blairites and the moderates, as they like to call themselves, of the Labour Party, are essentially, as you say, conflating Israel with Jewish people, which, of course, is anti-Semitic in itself. It's just the most staggering kind of paradox, really. It is unbelievable. I mean, with regards to the situation in the US, then, are we essentially seeing one and the same thing with what's happening in the UK with Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party with Ilhan Omar? Is it the same? Is it the lobby? Is it those who are opposed to Palestinian sort of freedom? Is that where it's coming from?
Oh, completely. I mean, it's very much the same, except you have someone who's a freshman in Congress who's not exactly about to be or on the precipice of becoming the next prime minister. I mean, in the UK, you have an actual left. We don't really have that here in the US. So one member of Congress actually comes out and says what we've all been saying for all this time, which everybody knows is true, which is not just, Ilhan Omar has not just said, that the AIPAC has disproportionate and malign influence in Washington, and that members of Congress are literally paid to ensure their loyalty to a foreign apartheid state, most of them Gentiles. It's not just that she said that, she's dressed Elliot Abrams down on Venezuela. Today, an interview was published in Politico where she said that Barack Obama and his failed leadership, his failed neoliberal centrist model, was a betrayal that helped pave the way for Donald Trump to come to power, because so many Americans felt betrayed and left out. She's saying things we've all been saying, but that are impermissible within the very narrow parameters of American partisan debate. I'd actually argue that you have a much more robust debate in the UK. We don't even have question hour. We don't even get to see our president get questioned. So, or our leader get questioned, since you don't have a president. But the point is that Ilhan Omar has made herself a target for all of those things, and because of the fear that she will mainstream views that have been considered radical and impermissible in the U.S. Beyond the Israel lobby, there is an obsessive campaign within the Republican Party, which has been projected through Fox News, kind of Clockwork Orange style, into the minds of middle American suburban Fox News watchers, that Ilhan Omar represents this foreign implant from a Middle Eastern terrorist country that has come here to change our way of life. And she's facing a lot of death threats as a result of it. I've even heard people just kind of, people talking about stuff they hear in Ohio or in Minnesota, where people say, well, she's going to get herself assassinated, which is sort of a death wish. It's driven, it's very much beyond the Israel lobby. But what we saw with the attempt to censor her and to pass a resolution condemning her was absolutely driven by the Israel lobby. And it proved her point when I saw someone from within the Democratic Party, a minor figure you never heard of named Josh Gottheimer from New Jersey, get up and condemn her and say, this is hate. And just remembering that this is one of the figures it's two members of Congress who issued a letter threatening to make Al Jazeera a foreign agent, to register as a foreign agent of influence, because it was going to release a hidden camera investigation on the Israel lobby that I actually participated in. And that Al Jazeera actually censored that documentary and never released it because of the threats of the Israel lobby, because it's a state broadcaster and Qatar could have faced the consequence. So in that situation and in the Ilhan Omar situation, you had a documentary that documented how malign and influential the Israel lobby was, and Ilhan Omar, a freshman member of Congress, saying that. And in each case, the wrath of the Beltway came down on them. And that proves their point. It just absolutely proves their point, and everybody knows it, and everybody knows that what Ilhan Omar said is true. And so the outrage is so fake. I think that there is an element in the population that's educated enough to see through this, and that draws them closer to Ilhan Omar. And so the happy ending here is that in many ways AIPAC was defeated. The plan was to get Ilhan Omar thrown off the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House. That failed. But also the plan was to issue a one-sided resolution condemning only anti-Semitism and not discussing, for example, right-wing, white nationalist domestic terror, which is what was responsible for the killing of Jews at the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh last year, and Islamophobia, which, as you and I know, is a much more pernicious problem in our societies. And so Ilhan Omar actually wound up voting for the resolution because it was broadened to that point. I think this is one of the biggest defeats for AIPAC since the Iran deal, and it's because of grassroots voices like ours.
So it's a fascinating analysis of what's going on in the US, because, as you quite rightly point out, I think in the UK, the boundaries of debate, if you like, are quite a lot broader in terms of even mainstream politics. Everyone knows Corbyn's history, everyone knows he's been highly critical of the Israeli government and Israeli policy in the past, and he is allowed to say that over here. There's no shock horror when he comes out and says it, if you like. But what's fascinating is that you say that essentially it's one of the biggest defeats ever for AIPAC in the US. Over here, that's not the end result of this situation. I mean, what we've seen politically is, for numerous reasons, not just this, but the Labour Party is getting fairly trounced in the opinion polls at the minute, if you believe the corporate media opinion polls. Some of them are more accurate than others. The mud, while it's not necessarily sticking, the mud keeps being slung, and he seems unable to bounce it off from any. There's no mainstream support, if you like, for him either at the minute. Even sort of those liberal commentators like Owen Jones came out and absolutely stunned members of the Labour Party when he supported Chris Williams' suspension. He didn't stun me, because he's a little snake in the grass anyway, and we all know he knows where his bread's buttered, and it's not necessarily always with Corbyn. But the end result doesn't appear to be the same as it is in the US. I mean, do you think it's going to continue to stick in the UK from what you know? Because there's, like I say, I mean, being on the ground here, and I was discussing this the other day on another show, it's just the bizarrest thing. It's literally, we have gone down the rabbit hole in this country, and yet everyone's believing it, and unfortunately I think the public as a broad whole are lapping it up. I mean, do you think that there is going to ever be that watershed moment where people finally go, no, actually this is all nonsense? Because it's not currently happening at all in mainstream discourse and on the ground with your everyday person.
Well, looking from the outside, I mean, you know more about it than I do, but it seems like there is a pretty strong element within the elite, the Labour Party, the discredited elite, the Blairite elite, that would rather see Jeremy Corbyn lose than Labour win. And they're largely behind this campaign to make that the case, and then to blame Corbyn and anti-Semitism for it. I think Tony Blair said that, didn't he?
Yeah, no, several of them come out and said it. Tony Blair said it. Chuka Umunna, the one who's gone off to lead this new independent group, said it. Peter Mandelson's come out and said it. I mean, Tom Watson, who's deputy leader of the Labour Party, he may as well say it, because he's performing this week almost this pincer movement on Corbyn to try and effectively oust him. It's right. Quite staggering. But yeah, no, I mean, there's lots of them openly say it, but there's hundreds of them who say it behind closed doors as well. Yeah.
And Miliband and all the rest of them. So, you know, let them come back into power and lose again, as they've always done. We have a similar situation building within the Democratic Party, or at least I would say within the Democratic presidential primary process, where Bernie Sanders, who has not been as forceful an advocate for Palestinians as Jeremy Corbyn, or as forceful in general, just sort of as authentically socialist as Jeremy Corbyn is, but someone who represents a threat to elite institutions and the consensus in the U.S. and within the Democratic Party, has really emerged as a front runner. And if you watch his rally in Brooklyn, where he launched his campaign, there isn't that kind of authentic grassroots energy behind any other candidate. You'd think he'd be the just inevitable choice, given how much energy is behind him, how much support he mobilized in 2016 with so much less money and no media. And yet the Democratic elite and the DNC are not willing, they're not going to be willing to do that. I think they would rather have, well, first of all, they're going to go through all the other options and try to get some corporate figure, or perhaps Elizabeth Warren, who isn't the worst option on a lot of domestic issues, instead of Bernie Sanders. And I think they might fail. And then we're going to witness a campaign, kind of a 1972 situation, where you have, on the one hand, the Republican candidate saying that a radical is going to, is running against him, who represents, rioters in the streets and socialism. And then you have the Democratic Party elite working against the nominee as well, under the same premises. I think that there are a lot of the funders of the Democratic Party, the corporate funders, have a lot more in common with Donald Trump than they do with Bernie Sanders at the end of the day. And they have the same interests, and they will sabotage him as a nominee if he somehow gets that far. And so I think the UK is really instructive for Americans who support Bernie Sanders or are interested in kind of breaking the neoliberal consensus here. And it's really disturbing to watch it take place. The difference between Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn is that Bernie Sanders comes from a Jewish family, is Jewish, is talking about his Jewish background much more openly than he had before. I think he's had family that were slaughtered in the Holocaust. I know that, his family fled as mine did from, hostile environment in Europe. And yet, I believe the lobby and the Republicans will, if he maintains his line on the Palestinians. 2 days ago, he called for an even-handed approach to Israel-Palestine and defended Ilhan Omar. If he maintains that, they'll call him an anti-Semite. And that will be just absolutely crazy. But it would be something I've experienced. So
yeah, and that is exactly how far down the rabbit hole we have gone. That and it will happen. You can just see it building with Sanders, and it will absolutely happen. And it really is the strangest period of time to be living in some respects. But no, I think you're right, and I mean, especially as you say, there's the same elements within the UK Labour Party as there are in the Democrats. It kind of perplexes me really, and it kind of makes me chuckle to the side slightly, because over here we have these 8 centrist or Blairite Labour MPs who've gone off and formed their own little independent group, and they're saying that politics is broken, it's not working anymore, we need a new alternative. And people put it to them, well, centrism is broken, that's why we've got the alternatives we have now. And they say, yes, well, it's new centrism, it's new centrism. And then you kind of think, so is that like Emmanuel Macron kind of new centrism, which is going really fucking well as well? Is that what it's just, when you break it down into like really basic terms, the whole situation it's absolute nonsense really. But I think it shows the desperation of the sort of the corporate lobbyists within the Labour Party, and also the corporate press. It's
emergency law centrism. That's what it is. Mark my words, if any of these people come into power, you're going to have a yellow vest movement in the UK, and they will be governing under emergency law as Macron does.
I think you're correct, and I think on that note, that's probably a brilliant way to wrap up. So there's some inspiration for us all there. Grab your yellow vests, because with Brexit, we don't know what's happening. Max, it was such a great pleasure to speak to you yet again. As always, brilliantly insightful. So transfixing to listen to. It was wonderful. Max Blumenthal, thank you ever so much for joining me on Topple Uncaged.
Thanks a lot, Steve, and thanks for the work everyone's doing at the Canary.